A peaceful afternoon interrupted. It was a bright and vibrant afternoon in Harmony Park, a sprawling oasis nestled in the heart of Denver, Colorado. The park buzzed with life. Children's laughter echoed as they played on swings, runners jogged along sunlit trails, and families sprawled on picnic blankets under grand oak trees. At the edge of a sparkling pond, Camille Rivers sat alone on a wooden bench. She had carved out this moment of solitude, a rare reprieve from her demanding career as a civil rights attorney. Her caramel-toned hands cradled a worn leather-bound journal, its pages teeming with handwritten notes and sketches from a life devoted to justice. Camille found solace in the simple act of being present. The rippling water of the pond mirrored the serenity she sought, but her peace was shattered by the sharp screech of tires. A black and white police cruiser skidded to a stop near the curb. The abrupt noise turned heads, disrupting the tranquil hum of the park. Two uniformed officers emerged from the vehicle, their movements brisk and purposeful. Officer Ryan Murdoch, tall and broad-shouldered, led the way, his expression unreadable but his posture brimming with authority. His partner, Officer Kevin Sloan, shorter but no less intimidating, followed closely behind. They scanned the park, their eyes narrowing when they locked onto Camille. The pair strode toward her, the sound of their boots crunching on the gravel cutting through the park's ambience. Camille glanced up from her journal, her sharp hazel eyes meeting theirs with calm curiosity. "Ma'am," Officer Murdoch began, his voice firm but edged with suspicion, "may we speak with you for a moment?" Camille closed her journal deliberately, setting it on the bench beside her. "Of course," she replied, her tone polite but tinged with a hint of wariness. Murdoch gestured toward the empty space next to her. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Camille tilted her head, her brow furrowing slightly. "I'm enjoying the park, reading and reflecting." "Is there a problem, officer?" "We received a call about suspicious activity in the area," Sloan interjected, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his hip. "You match the description." Camille's lips pressed into a thin line. She had defended countless clients against racial profiling and systemic bias, but experiencing it firsthand still stung. "I'm not sure how sitting quietly with a book qualifies as suspicious," she said evenly. "Can we see some identification?" Murdoch demanded, his voice losing the pretense of civility. Camille hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing on her. The gathered onlookers, though subtle, were watching closely. She reached into her tote bag and retrieved her wallet, handing over her driver's license. Murdoch scrutinized the ID with exaggerated care, as if expecting to uncover a hidden clue. "Camille Rivers," he read aloud, his tone dripping with mockery. "What exactly is your business here today, Ms. Rivers?" Camille's patience was thinning, but she maintained her composure. "I live here. This is my city. I come to this park often." "Does that answer your question?" Sloan stepped forward, his gaze colder than before. "Do you always carry around a journal like that?" Camille arched an eyebrow, incredulous. "A journal? Yes. It's how I organize my thoughts." "Is that a crime now?" The officers exchanged a glance. The tension in their body language was palpable, as if they had already decided Camille was guilty of some unspoken offense. Murdoch's tone sharpened. "We'll need you to come with us to the station for further questioning." Camille stood, her chin held high. "Am I being detained?" Murdoch's eyes narrowed. "You're being uncooperative. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The small crowd of park-goers began murmuring among themselves. A young woman standing near the pond discreetly raised her phone, recording the interaction. Camille's pulse quickened, but she knew better than to let fear show. Instead, she met Murdoch's gaze with a defiant calm. "I'm not resisting," she said, her voice steady. "I simply asked for clarification. If you're going to arrest me, you'd better have a valid charge." That was all the provocation Murdoch seemed to need. He grabbed Camille's arm, twisting it behind her back as Sloan snapped handcuffs around her wrists. "Stop resisting," Murdoch barked, though Camille was completely still. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, a mix of shock and indignation. "What's she even done?" someone called out. The woman with the phone stepped closer, her camera trained on the officers as they led Camille to the waiting cruiser. Camille locked eyes with the young woman for a brief moment. Her expression conveyed a silent message. "Don't stop recording. Let the world see this." The car doors slammed shut, cutting off the noise of the park. Camille was left alone with the echo of her racing thoughts and the hum of the cruiser's engine. As the vehicle pulled away, her mind buzzed with 1,000 questions. She had spent her career fighting against this very kind of injustice, and now she was living it. The irony was not lost on her, but as anger bubbled beneath the surface, it was quickly replaced by resolve. This was far from over. A system built to intimidate. The ride to the police station was suffocating. The silence in the cruiser was only broken by the crackle of the radio and the occasional muttered exchange between the officers in the front seats. Camille Rivers sat in the back, her wrists aching from the tight cuffs, her mind racing. Through the window, she watched familiar streets blur past, a city she loved, now tainted by this humiliating ordeal. She wasn't naive. Years as a civil rights attorney had shown her the darker side of the justice system, but nothing could prepare her for the stark reality of being on the other side of it. She mentally catalogued every detail of the arrest, from the officer's demeanor to the onlookers' reactions, knowing this would all be critical later. When the cruiser pulled into the station's lot, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the concrete. Camille braced herself as the car came to a stop. Sloan opened the door, his grip on her arm firm, but unnecessarily rough as he helped her out. "You'll want to cooperate," he muttered under his breath as they walked toward the station. His tone carried a hint of smug satisfaction, as if he already assumed the outcome of this encounter. Inside, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unflattering glow on the scuffed linoleum floors. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant lingered in the air. Officers moved about, some typing at computers, others chatting near a coffee machine. Heads turned as Camille was led past the front desk, her cuffs catching the light. Some glanced at her with mild curiosity, others with indifference, as if she were just another statistic. Murdoch steered her toward a processing desk, where a tired-looking officer with a clipboard sat waiting. "Name?" the officer asked without looking up. "Camille Rivers," Murdoch answered for her, handing over her ID. The officer scribbled on the form, then gestured toward a wall. "Stand over there for the mugshot." Camille's heart sank as she stepped in front of the camera. The humiliation of it all hit her like a wave, but she kept her expression neutral. The flash was blinding, but it wasn't the light that stung. It was the reality of how quickly she had been stripped of her dignity. After the mugshot, she was fingerprinted, her hands guided mechanically by the officer at the desk. The ink was cold, the process dehumanizing. Camille felt more like a case file than a person. "Take her to holding," Murdoch instructed, his tone as impersonal as ever. Sloan grabbed her arm again, leading her down a narrow hallway lined with metal doors. Each door had a small barred window, behind which shadowy figures shifted. Sloan unlocked one of the doors and pushed it open. "Welcome to your accommodations for the evening," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Camille stepped inside the small holding cell. It was bare, with a metal bench bolted to the wall and a toilet in the corner. The fluorescent light buzzed incessantly, casting an eerie glow. Sloan closed the door behind her with a resounding clang, leaving her alone in the oppressive silence. Reflection in the shadows. Camille sat on the cold bench, her hands now free of cuffs but still trembling. The gravity of the situation weighed on her. She thought of the countless clients she had represented, men and women who had sat in cells like this, many of them victims of a system designed to intimidate and control. She had always been able to offer them hope, a lifeline. Now she was the one needing reassurance. Her mind drifted back to the park, to the young woman who had recorded the arrest. Did she keep filming? Did she post the video online? Camille clung to the possibility that someone out there had witnessed her truth and wasn't willing to let it go unseen. Time passed slowly, the minutes stretching into hours. The cell was eerily quiet, save for the occasional muffled shout from another detainee. Camille paced the small space, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. She tried to distract herself by thinking through her options. Her first instinct was to call Marissa, her closest friend and fellow attorney. Marissa would know what to do. She always did. But as the hours dragged on without a phone call, Camille felt the creeping frustration of being powerless. It was a feeling she wasn't used to, and she hated it. Finally, the metallic jingle of keys echoed down the hall. A young officer approached her cell, clipboard in hand. His expression was guarded but lacked the hostility of Murdoch or Sloan. "Ms. Rivers," he said, unlocking the door. "You've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing an officer." "On what grounds?" Camille demanded, stepping out of the cell. Her voice was calm but firm, the same tone she used in the courtroom when dismantling weak arguments. The officer avoided her gaze. "You'll need to discuss that with the judge," he replied before leading her back to the front desk. Camille's release papers were waiting, but not without conditions. She was free on bail but expected to appear in court within the week. The walk of defiance. As Camille stepped out of the station, the cool night air hit her like a balm. She hadn't realized how stifling the station's atmosphere had been until she was free of it. A familiar figure waited by the curb. Marissa, her face a mixture of relief and fury. "Camille." Marissa rushed to her, wrapping her arms around her friend. "Are you okay? What happened in there?" Camille nodded, though her body betrayed her with a slight tremor. "I'm fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. "Just tired." As they drove away, the city's lights flashing past the car windows, Camille recounted the events of the day. Marissa listened intently, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "They can't get away with this," Marissa said, her voice brimming with anger. "We're going to fight this, Camille." "Oh, we're fighting it," Camille replied, her tone resolute. "I've spent my career defending others from this kind of treatment. It's time I used those skills for myself." When Camille returned home that night, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads and case law books. Exhaustion weighed on her, but she refused to rest. With each note she scribbled, each page she highlighted, her determination grew. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, humiliated, or dismissed. As the night deepened, Camille drafted the beginnings of a civil rights lawsuit. She outlined every detail, from the officer's actions to the systemic issues that enable them. Her pen moved furiously across the paper, fueled by a mix of anger and purpose. The fight had only just begun. Mobilizing the community for justice. The days following Camille's release felt like a blur. Between preparing her civil rights lawsuit and managing her existing workload, she barely had time to process the magnitude of what had happened. Yet, beneath the exhaustion was a simmering determination. This wasn't just about her arrest. It was about dismantling the systemic flaws that allowed such behavior to thrive. The morning after her release, Camille's phone buzzed incessantly with messages. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers reached out, offering support and outrage on her behalf. One message stood out among the flood, a link to a video. Clicking on it, Camille's heart raced as she saw herself on the screen. It was the footage from the park, captured by the young woman who had filmed the entire incident. The video was raw, unfiltered, and powerful. It showed the officer's interrogation, her calm responses, and the abrupt escalation to handcuffing her. The captions added by the uploader laid bare the injustice. Civil rights attorney harassed and arrested for reading in a park. The video had already gone viral, with thousands of comments pouring in. People were furious. Some shared similar stories of harassment, while others expressed their solidarity and called for accountability. Camille felt a mix of gratitude and frustration, grateful that her story was reaching a wider audience, frustrated that such incidents were all too common. Strategic alliances. Camille didn't waste time. She reached out to Marissa, who arrived at her apartment armed with coffee and her ever-present legal briefcase. Together, they pored over the video, dissecting every moment. "This is gold," Marissa said, pointing to the part where one officer accused Camille of resisting despite her clear compliance. "They have no case. Their actions were entirely unjustified." Camille nodded, her mind already working through the legal angles. "But it's not just about winning my case. We need to use this as a platform to push for systemic change." Marissa leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Then we need allies. Community leaders, activists, and maybe even some politicians. If we can turn this into a broader movement, we'll have a stronger chance of making a real impact." The two women spent the next few days contacting local organizations. Camille reached out to civil rights groups, community leaders, and even professors from the local university's law school. Many of them were already aware of her case, thanks to the viral video, and were eager to lend their support. One evening, Camille met with a group of activists at a community center. The room was packed, the air buzzing with a mix of anger and hope. People of all ages and backgrounds had gathered, united by a shared desire for justice. As Camille stood at the front of the room, she felt a swell of emotion. These were the people she was fighting for, the ones whose voices had been ignored for too long. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she started, her voice steady but passionate. "What happened to me is not unique. It's part of a pattern of systemic bias and abuse of power that we've allowed to persist for too long." The crowd murmured in agreement. Camille continued, her words flowing with conviction. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has ever been silenced, humiliated, or treated as less than because of the color of their skin or the assumptions others make about them. Together, we can change that." Her speech was met with applause, and as the meeting progressed, plans began to take shape. They discussed organizing protests, holding town halls, and launching a petition to demand police reform. Camille knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but the momentum in the room gave her hope. A growing movement. Within a week, the movement had gained significant traction. The hashtag Justice for Camille trended on social media, with celebrities and public figures lending their voices to the cause. Local news stations picked up the story, broadcasting interviews with Camille and members of the community. Camille remained focused, balancing her role as a leader in the movement with her responsibilities as an attorney. She spent her days meeting with allies, drafting legal documents, and preparing for her court appearance. At night, she worked on the lawsuit, her determination unwavering. One afternoon, Camille received a call from an unexpected source, a young reporter from a prominent national news outlet. The reporter, Elena Morales, had seen the viral video and was eager to cover the story in depth. "I want to do more than just report on what happened," Elena said. "I want to explore the systemic issues behind it and highlight the work you're doing to address them." Camille hesitated. She had been careful about engaging with the media, wary of how her words might be twisted. But something about Elena's sincerity convinced her to agree. The interview took place in Camille's home, where she felt most comfortable. As the cameras rolled, she recounted her experience with a mix of vulnerability and resolve. "What struck me the most," Camille said, "was how quickly those officers assumed I didn't belong. I wasn't a person to them. I was a problem to be removed. That's why this fight matters, because no one should ever feel like their humanity is up for debate." The interview aired a few days later, sparking a national conversation. People from all walks of life began sharing their stories, creating a groundswell of support for Camille's cause. Confronting the system. As the movement grew, so did the pressure on the police department. Facing mounting public scrutiny, the department announced that an internal investigation would be conducted into the officers' actions. Camille knew this was a standard move, more about damage control than genuine accountability. but she saw it as a small victory nonetheless. Meanwhile, her court date loomed. Camille spent hours preparing, reviewing every detail of her arrest, and building a case that would expose the officer's misconduct. She knew that winning in court was crucial, not just for her own vindication, but for the broader message it would send. As she stood in her office one evening, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, Marissa walked in holding a newspaper. The headline read, "Attorney Arrest Sparks Movement for Police Reform." Marissa grinned. "You're making waves, Camille." Camille smiled back, though her expression was tinged with fatigue. "We're making waves, and we're just getting started." The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Camille felt like the tide was turning. The courtroom showdown. The day of Camille's court hearing arrived with a heavy weight of anticipation. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the next chapter of her fight for justice. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Camille" and "End Police Bias" were held high, their messages amplified by chants from a growing crowd. Camille emerged from the car alongside Marissa, her head held high and her demeanor composed. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, she exuded confidence, though her heart raced beneath the surface. The cameras flashed incessantly as she ascended the steps, each click capturing her resolve. "Ms. Rivers, how do you feel about today's hearing?" a reporter called out. Camille paused briefly, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. "I feel ready," she replied simply, her voice firm. "Ready to hold people accountable and ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Inside the courthouse, the courtroom was packed, with every seat filled and more people standing along the back wall. The air buzzed with tension as Camille entered, her presence commanding immediate attention. She glanced at the defendant's table, where Officers Murdoch and Sloan sat stiffly, their lawyer whispering urgently to them. Both officers avoided her gaze, their earlier bravado replaced with visible discomfort. The judge, an older man with a reputation for fairness, entered the room, and the court was called to order. Camille's lawyer, a seasoned civil rights attorney named Derek Carter, rose to deliver the opening statement. "Your Honor," Derek began, his voice resonating with purpose, "this case is about more than just the actions of two officers. It's about a pattern, a deeply rooted problem within our law enforcement system. Ms. Rivers was targeted, interrogated, and ultimately arrested without cause. Today, we will show that her rights were violated, and that such actions cannot and will not be tolerated." The prosecutor representing the officers countered with a statement laced with defensiveness. "Your Honor, my clients acted in accordance with their training and the circumstances presented to them. They received a call reporting suspicious activity, and their actions were intended to ensure public safety." Camille sat quietly, her face unreadable. But inside, she was cataloging every word, every tone, every implication. She knew this wasn't just about what happened to her. It was about exposing the broader systemic failures that allowed such incidents to occur. Testimonies begin. The first witness was a young woman named Maya, the bystander who had recorded the viral video. As she took the stand, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "I was at the park with my little sister," Maya began, glancing at Camille with a reassuring nod. "We were sitting by the pond when we saw the officers approach Ms. Rivers. At first, I thought it was a routine check, but their tone, it just didn't feel right. They kept pressing her with questions, even though she clearly wasn't doing anything wrong." The prosecutor tried to discredit Maya, suggesting she couldn't hear the entire exchange and was making assumptions. But Maya held her ground, pointing out that the video spoke for itself. Next, Derek called an expert witness, a former police captain who had turned whistleblower. He provided a detailed analysis of the officers' actions, highlighting deviations from standard protocol and the lack of justification for their use of force. "What we see here," the expert concluded, gesturing toward a still frame from the video displayed on a screen, "is not an officer attempting to de-escalate a situation. This is an officer asserting dominance, which escalates an otherwise peaceful interaction. The evidence was damning, and the courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the expert stepped down. Officers on the stand. When it was time for Officers Murdoch and Sloan to testify, the tension in the room peaked. Murdoch went first, his demeanor rigid as he swore the oath. Derek's cross-examination was sharp, methodical, and unrelenting. Officer Murdoch. Derek began, pacing slowly in front of the jury. You claimed that Ms. Rivers was behaving suspiciously. Can you define exactly what behavior led you to that conclusion? Murdoch hesitated, his eyes darting toward his lawyer before answering. She was sitting alone in the park, and we received a call about suspicious activity in the area. Derek raised an eyebrow. Sitting alone with a book is suspicious activity. It wasn't just that, Murdoch stammered. We had reason to believe she might be involved in. Reason to believe. Derek interrupted, his voice rising slightly. Or assumptions based on biases. Murdoch's silence was deafening. Sloan fared no better. His attempts to justify their actions were weak and inconsistent, his discomfort evident as Derek methodically dismantled their narrative. Camille's turn. Finally, it was Camille's turn to take the stand. As she swore the oath and sat down, she felt the weight of every eye in the room on her. This wasn't just about her testimony. It was about giving voice to everyone who had ever been in her position. Ms. Rivers, Derek began, his tone gentle, can you describe what happened that day in your own words? Camille took a deep breath. I went to the park to clear my mind, to find a moment of peace. I brought a book, as I often do, and I was sitting quietly by the pond when the officers approached me. Their tone was confrontational from the start, and it quickly became clear that I was being targeted, not for anything I did, but for who I am. She paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. As an attorney, I've spent years advocating for justice and fairness. I know my rights, and I knew what they were doing was wrong. But in that moment, none of that seemed to matter. To them, I wasn't a person. I was a suspect. Her voice remained steady, but the emotion behind her words was palpable. The jury, the spectators, even the judge seemed captivated. A moment of hope. As Camille stepped down from the stand, she felt a swell of pride. She had spoken her truth, and now the outcome was in the hands of the court. The proceedings continued late into the evening, with both sides presenting their closing arguments. Derek's final words echoed through the courtroom. Justice is not just a principle, it's a promise. A promise that every individual, regardless of their race, gender, or background, will be treated with dignity and respect. Today, this court has the opportunity to uphold that promise. As the jury retired to deliberate, Camille stepped outside to find a crowd still gathered, their chants filling the evening air. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope, not just for her own case, but for the change she was beginning to see around her. The fight wasn't over, but Camille knew she wasn't alone. The verdict and its ripple effect. The day the verdict was announced was one of tense anticipation. The courthouse was packed with spectators, reporters, and supporters, their voices echoing in the marble hallways. Camille sat in the courtroom alongside her attorney, Derek Carter, her composure masking the storm of emotions brewing inside. This wasn't just a verdict on her case, it was a verdict on justice itself. The jury had deliberated for hours the previous day, their solemn faces now reflecting the weight of their decision. As they filed back into the courtroom, the air grew still, thick with unspoken tension. All rise, the bailiff called, and everyone stood as Judge Willis entered. He took his seat, his expression unreadable, and gestured for the jury foreperson to proceed. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood and cleared her throat. We have, Your Honor. Camille's heart pounded as the foreperson unfolded the paper in her hands. Time seemed to stretch impossibly long. In the case of Camille Rivers versus Officers Murdoch and Sloan, the foreperson began, we find the defendants guilty of unlawful detention, racial profiling, and misconduct. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Camille exhaled sharply, her hands gripping the edge of the table as relief washed over her. The murmurs of the spectators quickly grew into applause, which the judge silenced with a sharp rap of his gavel. "Order in the court," Judge Willis said firmly. He turned his attention to the officers, who sat pale and rigid. "Officers Murdoch and Sloan, the jury has found you guilty. Your actions violated the trust placed in you as public servants and undermined the principles of fairness and justice that you were sworn to uphold. This court will schedule a hearing to determine the appropriate penalties." The officer's lawyer tried to interject, but the judge cut him off with a withering glance. "Your clients have had their say. Now, the law will have its." Victory and vindication. As the gavel struck to adjourn the session, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Camille turned to Derek, who offered her a triumphant smile. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. "No," Camille replied, shaking her head. "We did it, and this is just the beginning." As she left the courthouse, the crowd outside greeted her with a thunderous ovation. Signs with slogans like "Justice for All" and "Accountability Matters" waved high above the crowd. The atmosphere was electric, a blend of celebration and determination. A young woman pushed through the crowd to reach Camille. It was Maya, the bystander who had filmed the video. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she extended a hand. "Ms. Rivers, I just wanted to say thank you. What you've done here, it means so much." Camille smiled warmly, taking Maya's hand. "Thank you for what you did. Without your video, this might not have been possible." The two women shared a moment of quiet understanding before Camille turned to address the crowd. She stepped up to a makeshift podium, her voice steady as it carried over the chants. "This victory belongs to all of us," she began. "To everyone who has ever faced injustice, who has ever been silenced or ignored. Today, we've proven that accountability is possible. But let me be clear, our work is far from over. Real change takes time, effort, and unwavering commitment. And I promise you, I will not stop fighting until this system works for everyone." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy infectious. For the first time in weeks, Camille felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for the broader fight ahead. A catalyst for change, the verdict had an immediate ripple effect. News outlets across the country picked up the story, highlighting both the trial's outcome and the larger movement it had inspired. The video of Camille's speech outside the courthouse went viral, spreading her message far and wide. Local officials, feeling the pressure from the public, announced a series of reforms aimed at addressing racial profiling and police misconduct. These included mandatory bias training for officers, increased transparency in complaint investigations, and the creation of a civilian oversight board. Camille was invited to speak at town halls, universities, and conferences, where she used her platform to push for further reforms. She emphasized the importance of community involvement, urging people to stay engaged and hold their leaders accountable. Her lawsuit against the police department also moved forward, gaining momentum as additional evidence of systemic issues surfaced. Former officers came forward with stories of their own, exposing a culture of complacency and cover-ups. Camille knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but the progress being made was undeniable. A personal reckoning. Despite the public victory, Camille couldn't ignore the personal toll the ordeal had taken. Late at night, when the world was quiet, she would replay the events of her arrest in her mind. The humiliation, the fear, the anger, it all lingered like a shadow. Marissa noticed the strain and insisted on taking Camille out for dinner one evening. Over plates of comfort food and glasses of wine, they finally talked about everything that had happened. "You've been carrying so much," Marissa said gently. "It's okay to let yourself feel it, you know." Camille nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know. It's just hard. Even with the victory, I can't help but think about how many others haven't had the same outcome." "That's why you're doing this," Marissa reminded her. Not just for yourself, but for all the others who've been through it. And look at what you've already accomplished. You're changing things, Camille." The words gave Camille a sense of comfort, a reminder that her fight was not in vain. Looking ahead, in the weeks that followed, Camille continued to balance her legal career with her activism. She helped draft legislation aimed at increasing police accountability and partnered with community organizations to provide resources for victims of misconduct. One evening, as she sat at her desk reviewing a new batch of case files, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from a young law student. "Dear Ms. Rivers," it began, "your story inspired me to go to law school. I want to fight for justice the way you do. Thank you for showing me that one person can make a difference." Camille smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She had always believed in the power of the law to create change, but now she saw the ripple effect of her actions. Her fight was inspiring others to join the cause, and that was perhaps the greatest victory of all. As she closed the email, Camille looked out the window at the city she loved. The work was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever came next. A legacy of justice. Months had passed since the courtroom victory, but Camille Rivers' fight for justice had only just begun. The courtroom drama had sparked a nationwide movement, and Camille had become a symbol of hope for many. Yet for her, this wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about ensuring that no one else would endure the indignities she had faced. Her days were consumed with advocacy, litigation, and countless meetings. She was working with a coalition of activists, lawyers, and community leaders to draft comprehensive police reform legislation. The bill, tentatively titled the Equal Justice and Accountability Act, aimed to address racial profiling, enhance transparency in law enforcement, and establish stronger civilian oversight mechanisms. The work was grueling, but Camille thrived under the pressure. She knew the stakes were too high to falter. A personal sacrifice. As the movement grew, so did Camille's responsibilities. Her inbox was flooded with requests for speaking engagements, interviews, and collaboration proposals. But the demands of her work came at a personal cost. Late nights at her office became routine, leaving little time for friends, family, or self-care. Marissa, ever the concerned friend, staged an intervention one evening, arriving at Camille's apartment unannounced with a bag of groceries and a bottle of wine. "You're burning the candle at both ends," Marissa said, setting down the bag and pulling Camille away from her laptop. "You need to take care of yourself too." Camille sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know, Marissa. It's just, there's so much to do. And every time I slow down, I think about all the people who don't have the resources or the platform to fight back. I can't let them down." Marissa placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're doing amazing work, Camille. But even warriors need rest. If you burn out, who's going to lead this fight?" Reluctantly, Camille agreed to take the evening off. They cooked dinner together, reminiscing about their law school days and laughing over shared memories. It was a brief but much-needed reprieve, a reminder that even in the midst of a battle, moments of joy were essential. A new challenge. As Camille's profile grew, so did the resistance. Opponents of her work, ranging from police unions to political commentators, began to push back. She was accused of being anti-law enforcement, despite her consistent messaging that accountability strengthened communities. Anonymous threats arrived in the mail, and online trolls flooded her social media with hateful comments. One morning, while reviewing case files at her office, Camille's assistant, Rachel, entered with a concerned look. "Camille, you should see this," Rachel said, handing her a tablet. The screen displayed a news segment featuring a police union representative denouncing Camille's efforts. "She's not about reform," the man said, his tone accusatory. "She's about tearing down the system. Her so-called reforms are just anti-police propaganda." Camille's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She knew this was a tactic, an attempt to discredit her and shift the narrative. Later that day, she issued a statement to the press. Standing before a crowd of reporters, her voice was firm and unwavering. "I want to make one thing clear," she began. "This movement is not about tearing down law enforcement. It's about building it back up in a way that serves and protects everyone, not just a select few. Accountability is not the enemy of justice. It is the foundation of it. Those who resist reform are clinging to a broken system, and that's not just a disservice to the public. It's a disservice to the many honorable officers who strive to do their jobs with integrity." Her words struck a chord, and the tide began to shift once more. The Reform Bill, the Equal Justice and Accountability Act, was finally introduced to the state legislature after months of tireless effort. The bill proposed several groundbreaking measures, including mandatory body cameras for all officers, with strict guidelines on their usage; civilian oversight boards with investigative powers; elimination of qualified immunity, holding officers accountable for misconduct; bias training designed by independent experts; transparent data collection on stops, arrests, and use of force incidents. The bill faced fierce opposition, with some lawmakers calling it overly ambitious and others claiming it would hinder police effectiveness. But Camille and her coalition were undeterred. They organized town halls, rallies, and lobbying campaigns, mobilizing thousands of constituents to contact their representatives and demand action. A turning point. The day of the legislative vote was a pivotal moment. The state capitol was packed with activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens who had traveled from across the state to witness history. Camille sat in the gallery, her heart pounding as the roll call began. One by one, lawmakers cast their votes. The ayes and nays seemed evenly matched, each declaration heightening the tension. When the final vote was tallied, the Speaker of the House announced the result. The bill had passed by a narrow margin. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Camille felt a wave of emotion surge through her, a mixture of relief, triumph, and renewed determination. This was a significant victory, but it was only the beginning. Beyond the courtroom, with the bill's passage, Camille's work shifted to ensuring its implementation. She worked closely with community leaders and policymakers to establish the oversight boards and training programs mandated by the new law. She also continued to represent clients in cases of police misconduct, using her platform to shine a light on the ongoing need for reform. One day, Camille received a letter from a young woman named Leila, who had been inspired by her story. "Dear Ms. Rivers," the letter began, "I used to feel powerless, like the system would never change. But seeing what you've done has given me hope. I'm starting law school next year because I want to make a difference, just like you." Reading the letter, Camille felt a surge of pride. She had set out to fight for justice, and in doing so, she had inspired others to join the cause. A legacy in progress. Years later, Camille would reflect on these events as the foundation of her legacy. The reforms she had fought for became a model for other states, sparking a national movement toward police accountability. But for Camille, the greatest reward wasn't the accolades or the recognition. It was the knowledge that she had made a difference. She often returned to Harmony Park, the place where her journey had begun. Sitting by the pond, she would watch children play and families gather, the peaceful scene a reminder of what she was fighting to protect. Her fight for justice was far from over, but as she gazed out over the water, she felt a profound sense of hope. Change was possible, and it was happening. One case, one reform, one voice at a time. A new chapter of advocacy. In the years following the legislative victory, Camille Rivers' life became a mosaic of milestones, challenges, and deeply rewarding moments. Her civil rights work expanded beyond the courtroom and state legislature, reaching national and even international stages. Invitations to speak at global human rights conferences poured in, where she shared her story and the lessons learned from her battle for justice. Camille also helped establish the Justice Rising Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of police misconduct, advocating for policy reform, and empowering communities to demand accountability. The foundation provided legal aid, hosted educational workshops, and funded grassroots initiatives aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. The ripple effect. The reforms spearheaded by Camille's efforts in Colorado inspired other states to adopt similar measures. Across the country, police departments began implementing mandatory bias training. Body cameras became a standard tool of accountability, and civilian oversight boards gained real investigative power. The elimination of qualified immunity, once considered unattainable, became a central demand of reform movements nationwide. Despite the progress, Camille remained acutely aware that the fight for justice was a continuous one. Every victory was accompanied by new challenges, and every step forward illuminated how much further there was to go. But the sight of real, tangible change, of lives impacted and systems reformed, kept her going. A personal triumph. One crisp autumn morning, Camille returned to Harmony Park, the place where her ordeal had begun. She carried with her a sense of closure. The park had been the site of a grave injustice, but it was also where her journey of transformation and advocacy had taken root. As she walked along the familiar path, she noticed a small group gathered near the pond. They were community members attending one of the Justice Rising Foundation's workshops, learning about their rights and how to engage in civic action. Camille smiled, her heart swelling with pride. This was her vision come to life. Empowered individuals reclaiming their voices and their rights. She approached the group, and a young woman turned to her with wide eyes. "Ms. Rivers," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "It's such an honor to meet you. Your story is what inspired me to get involved." Camille shook the woman's hand warmly. "Thank you for being here. It's people like you who make change possible." The final address. That evening, Camille stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, delivering the keynote address at the annual Justice Rising Gala. Activists, policymakers, community leaders, and supporters filled the room, their energy palpable. "This journey began with a moment of indignity," Camille said, her voice resonating through the hall. "But it became a movement, not because of one person, but because of all of you. Every protester, every advocate, every person who refused to stay silent. This victory belongs to you." She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "Change is not easy, and it's never finished, but we've proven that it's possible. And as long as there are voices demanding justice, as long as there are people willing to stand up and fight, we will keep moving forward." The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation, their applause echoing through the space. Camille stood on the stage, humbled and inspired by the collective power of the movement she had helped ignite. Epilogue. A legacy solidified. Years later, Camille's work would be enshrined in history books and taught in classrooms as a defining moment in the fight for justice and equality. The Equal Justice and Accountability Act became a model for similar legislation worldwide, and the Justice Rising Foundation continued to expand its reach, transforming lives and communities. Camille herself remained grounded, always returning to the park that had once been the site of her arrest. It became a place of reflection and renewal, a symbol of how far she and the world had come. As she sat by the pond one last time, now surrounded by children laughing and families enjoying the serene atmosphere, Camille opened her old leather-bound journal. On the first blank page, she wrote, "Justice is not a destination. It is a journey, and every step forward is worth the fight." With that, she closed the book, her heart full of hope, and walked away, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead.